And then he says that today in our simultaneous world, such changes are felt as abrupt and drastic. They always were, but now we notice. So we're kind of, with all this proliferation of new media that was going on in McLuhan's day, and in the 1950s, media really was proliferating. It was undergoing a kind of Cambrian explosion of media forms with comic books and LPs and newspapers, radio, television, new forms of the magazine, new forms of the paperback, the LP record. All this stuff that's coming in is a media explosion. Now, though, my hypothesis, my thesis in the new media invasion is that we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing now, with the rise of the internet, a media extinction event. All these media are disappearing, imploding, and dissolving as the internet impacts this media landscape like a meteor and destroys it, and is leaving standing only electronic media for the most part. All these other forms of media are disappearing. We've seen the disappearance of one medium after the next in the past 15 years. We've got the closure of the record store, bookstores are closing, magazines and newspapers are folding up and going into online formats. Probably the magazine and the newspaper in their paper forms will eventually disappear. I would give them 10 years, maybe 15 at most, before they're gone. The book itself is giving way to the Kindle and the Nook. That too will probably impact the book, so that within probably 50 years or so, the book will have been a memory and it'll just be something electronic. So we're now living under an ecology of technological circumstances that is the exact opposite to the age of the 1950s, where McLuhan was living in the sunset effect of media. It's final explosion of a diversity of forms. So he says, let's now take a quick tour of the walls knocked over by media change. Writing was the breakthrough from sound to sight. But with the end of the acoustic wall came chronology. This is the advent of high civilization with writing, cuneiform and hieroglyphic writing. We get chronology, tick-tock time, architecture, monumental temples and Egyptian pyramids. Writing, the enclosure of speech and sound space, split off song and dance and music from speech. It split off harmonia from mimesis. Song is basically just slowed speech, and writing speeds up the metabolism. Writing permitted the visual analysis of the dynamic logos that produced philology, logic, rhetoric, geometry, etc. Writing favors specialization in the creation of the Greek academy. Modern physics and mathematics, like modern art before them, gradually abandoned visual for acoustic or non-Euclidean. Of course, modern art is basically based on the disintegration of Euclidean space, which is to say visually connected, rational, perspectival space that the Impressionists first began to break apart, and with Cezanne, you began to get the complete abolition of the laws of perspective. He's doing that. The mathematicians have already worked out non-Euclidean geometry, which will then serve the basis, especially with Riemannian geometry, for what Einstein is doing at the same time that both Cezanne and Picasso are inventing modern art in Cubism, which is based on multiple times and multiple spaces coexisting simultaneously on the same canvas. With writing on paper came the road and paper, and remember we saw that paper came in the West about the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. The road and paper meant organization at a distance, armies, empires, and the end of city walls, because with paper you can begin to organize society in a long-distance manner. But the manuscript was far from being the printed page. It was nearer to our photographic journalism. It had to be read slowly, aloud. Remember, silent reading comes in mostly with the printing press, because the printing press has the effect of macadamizing the handwriting of the scribe so that it's smooth and easy to read. Also, the printing press brought in, more or less stabilized, these structures pre-existed the printing press, but stabilized them. The table of contents, the index, proper citation of the author, a title page, all of that comes in a stable, rational, linear space that is brought about by the printing press, which then enabled the creation, also notice, of intellectual copyright. Intellectual property laws followed from this, because now you could keep track of the author, and by proper citations you could keep track of who was citing whom. And so intellectual property laws began to come in at that point. With things like YouTube and the internet, intellectual property laws are going to have to change. The corporations keep hanging on to them for dear life, but as a matter of fact, they're going to have to change, and probably the end result will be the complete meltdown of these laws. And the solution will become more and more evident that what's going to pay for all this is, of course, advertising, which is what Google gradually figured out with their search engine and now their website, YouTube, which has more and more advertising on it every time you look at it. And the corporations are just going to have to learn that the money's going to come from the advertising, not from licensing fees this stuff is going to appear at light speed, and they can't compete with the speed of light of the new media that enables individual to put up videos like this one or favorite scenes from movies, and they just proliferate with hydraic effect. Hercules cuts off the head of Hydra, and two more spring up into its place, and so what happens on the internet is a hydraic effect. You get the virtual proliferation of images and videos that just happen way too fast for the old copyright laws to keep up with. They're going to have to disappear and change. The laws have to keep pace with the media transformations. The media can't be harnessed by the laws. It's the other way around. So with print from movable type came fast silent reading. Print knocked down the monastic walls of social and corporate study, the Bible, religion without walls, and of course the printing press fostered the Protestant Revolution, which basically put the copy of the Bible into the hands of each man, and so you began to get the church without walls at that point. But print isolated the scholar. Basically, one of the side effects of the print, as Elizabeth Eisenstein writes in her book about the history of the printing press, is that it created the encyclopedically learned scholar, the Montaigne, the Erasmus, these new individuals who knew everything about everything. It created the enterprising individual who, like Marlowe's Tamerlane or Dr. Faustus, could overrun time and history and cultures and peoples with his own intellect, presumably. Print evoked the walls of the classroom. The modern education system, the school system, came into being during the 17th century, about this time. Print could channel so much information to the individual that had previously been in the mind and memory of the teacher alone that it upset all existing educational practices and inserted walls now with the creation of schools and classrooms. It upset the monopoly of Latin by making possible multilingual study. Latin began to slowly disappear with the rise of the printing press, so that you still have in the 17th century Descartes with lots of text of his in both French and Latin. By the time you get to Voltaire at the end of the 18th century, he's only writing in French. Latin is a thing of the past. It fostered the vernaculars and enlarged the walls between nations. Print not only creates the private learned individual and his reading public, it also helped foster the creation of nationalism and nation-state communities, as Benedict Anderson has written about in his book Imagined Communities. It speeded up language, thereby setting new walls between speech and song and instrumentation. Print led to spoken poetry and silently read poetry, thus changing the nature of verse entirely. Now we get the individual alone in his book-lined study, silently reading, and we start getting these appearing in paintings in Rembrandt, who begins to paint the new type, the new iconotype of the silent individual sitting alone in a corner. He has these old mothers with their copy of the Bible with weird light illuminating from the Bible, and they're sitting there quietly reading these texts to themselves. That's a new effect of the printing world. It creates a private space around the individual. Print led to spoken poetry. Let's see, printed music entirely changed the structures of musical forms. In America, print and book culture became the dominant form from the beginning, setting walls between literature and art and life, which were less obvious in Europe. In America, print was a technological matrix of all subsequent invention. As he said in a previous essay, the printed page in America came over minus the manuscript oral traditions, and it laid the basis for the creation of American technocratic society. Its assembly lines finally reached expression in Detroit and the motor car, the home without walls. The automobile is indeed a home without walls. In America, the press molded public opinion and created a new base for politics. The press was a means of mobilizing public opinion and made national road systems. The interstate highway system was coming in the exact year in 1956 that McLuhan was writing this essay. Eisenhower had gone on trips across America and was appalled at the condition of the roads, and so he put in the Federal Interstate Highway Act, which created the most elaborate concentration of highways and freeways in the world, and it's beginning in 1956 in America. The press became in large measure a substitute for the book, but the press page is not the book page. The press creates new mental habits because, of course, as we've seen, the newspaper is basically a collection of book pages, all set one beside the other on the same page. With telegraph, only vernacular walls remain. All other cultural walls collapse under the impact of its instantaneous flash. With a wire photo, the vernacular walls are undermined. The telegraph translates writing into sound. So the telegraph translates writing into sound. You get the tap, tap, tap of the telegraph, which is now bringing sound to writing, so it's beginning to retrieve the oral acoustic. The electrification of writing was almost as big a step back toward the acoustic world as those steps since taken by telephone, radio, TV. And then he says, you can see him getting ready to write pretty soon, the understanding media, when he says here, the telephone, speech without walls. The phonograph, music hall without walls, because of course the phonograph, you can listen to it now in your home. You don't have to go to the concert hall to watch the performance. The photograph, museum without walls, as we've seen with Andre Malraux, which brings the art museum home into your house. And then the movie and TV, classroom without walls, because they saturate the environment with information that competes with the information that's based on the old Gutenbergian world of books in the classroom. And the student finds himself caught in a difficult situation in these classrooms where the environment around him is bombarding him with information and impulses that are at odds with the first one thing, then another rectilinearity of what he's being taught in the classrooms. Before print, the community at large was the center of education. Today, information flow and educational impact outside the classroom is so far in excess of anything occurring inside the classroom that we must reconsider the educational process itself, hence the classroom without walls. The classroom is now a place of detention, not attention. Attention is elsewhere, he says. The kids are interested in what's going on beyond the walls of the classroom. It is now obvious, his final aphorism here, it is now obvious that as all languages are mass media, not just radio and TV and so forth, so the new media are new languages. To unscramble our babble, we must teach these languages and their grammars on their own terms. This is something quite different from the educational use of audiovisual aids or of closed-circuit TV. So we've got a new world configured here, and McLuhan is the man who is up to the task to begin to study it and to lay down the basic laws of the media, which is exactly what he will then proceed to do.